Hello, we are sharing digitally this week our SAT Bootcamp and the second installment of our SAT Bootcamp. And this week we are focusing on the subscore words in context. This is typically a strong area for Chatfield students over the past few years, but we still want to share strategies around it because there are a large amount of questions that fit this words in context subscore on the SAT each time and on this upcoming SAT that we have coming up. A note is that words in context questions show up in both the reading section and the writing and language section of the SAT. So you'll see them in both the first section of the test and the second section of the test. We are going to focus our efforts today on how words in context show up in the reading section. And then a future boot camp session, we will look at how it shows up in the writing and lang section. As a reminder, there's 4 sections in the SAT. There's the reading, the writing and language, the math with no calculator, and the math with calculator. Today we're going to focus on tips and tricks, and specifically the words in context questions in that first section, the reading section. The reading section is made up of 5 passages. Each of the passages are 700 to 750 words, and they always go in this order. The first passage is a fiction passage, the second is social studies, the third is science, the fourth is social studies, and the fifth is science. It's important to know this order so that you're prepared and so that you can play to your strengths and choose which passages you want to spend the most time on given where your strengths lie. There are 4 single passages and 1 paired passage where you look at 2 different writing samples in a passage. That most often shows up in the 4th or 5th passage and will be a social studies or science type passage when you're looking at the paired passage. Couple things to know when looking at the reading section. A reminder that this is the first section. It is 52 questions that take place over the course of 65 minutes. That means that you have about 13 minutes per passage. If you're going to do this the correct way, you should read the passage in about 3 to 4 minutes, which would allow you 50 to 60 seconds per question. It's important to keep this timing up because it may be quicker than what you're used to when you're reading and answering questions with passages in your different classes. And it's important to practice, and use all the different resources you have to work on that timing and moving quickly. Today we're specifically looking at words in context. We have some examples here about how the context of a word can change the meaning of it, or how the meaning of a word can change when it's placed in different contexts. So our first example is the word restrain. Depending on the context, restrain can have several different meanings. First, it could mean to hold back physically, as in his classmates had to restrain him from eating the last cupcake. It could also mean to control emotions. I wasn't able to restrain my excitement upon winning the tournament. I threw my ping pong paddle into the crowd and hit my poor brother on the forehead, knocking him out. Or to limit. The embargoes and tariffs were designed to restrain trade. As you can see, restrain can take on different meanings and different definitions when they're placed in different contexts. Compromise is another example. As a verb, compromise has 3 distinct meanings. First, it can mean to settle a dispute by mutual agreement and concession. My sister wanted to listen to hip hop and my brother wanted to listen to bebop. So we compromised and put on some R&B. That's to settle a dispute by mutual agreement and concession. It could also mean to accept a standard that is below what is desirable. I am willing to accept another motel room, but I'm not prepared to compromise on hygiene. Or to endanger by foolish behavior. When Skywalker went along, he compromised the entire mission because Vader could sense his proximity. That would mean to endanger by foolish behavior. As you can see, compromise is another example of a word that can have multiple definitions depending on where it lies within context of other words and other passages. Another example is discriminate. Discriminate is often used in a negative way, but it can also be positive. Most often it's used to judge or make unfair distinction about people based on race, age, or gender. Widespread racial discrimination led to the disenfranchisement of thousands. But it could also mean to tell apart. Death doesn't discriminate between the sinners and the saints, or to note subtle differences. The dolphin's electroreception enables it to better discriminate between shrimp and crayfish on the muddy river. You've seen from each of these three examples, discriminate, compromise, and restrain, that words can change in different contexts. And this is what the SAT does most often, is they will take a word and ask you to be able to decipher what the definition is by looking at it in the different contexts. So all the words that you're going to see when looking at the SAT in words in context are going to be embedded in multi-paragraph passages. They can relate to many different subject areas, and the important thing is that they always rely on context to supply the meaning. Back when I was taking the SAT, or when your parents were taking the SAT, you often had to learn obscure words and just be able to tell the definition just based off the word or look at analogies. Now, all the vocabulary within the SAT relies on context to supply the meaning and has to do with context clues. So ask yourself, how do you use context to supply the meaning? There's two ways that the SAT test uses context and context clues across its test. So today we're going to focus on the first way. The first way is identifying the precise meaning of a word in context. So you are basically choosing the best definition, and it has to do entirely with context clues. In a future boot camp, we will look at how context clues also has to do with analyzing words in context to determine the meaning, the tone, or the style of the passage. So when we're looking at main idea or the topic or the author's purpose in a passage, that also can have to do with words in context. And like I said, we'll look at that in the future. Today, we are going to focus on identifying the precise meaning of a word or phrase. A couple strategies before we get started. Here, you have to read these passages anyway, so you might as well try to enjoy reading them. You can often choose the passage that you would like to start with based on the topic that is the most interesting to you if you were to preview the passages. You should scan the questions before you go and read the text. What this will do is it'll make sure when you are reading the text over the course of that 3 to 4 minutes that certain things draw your attention because you've already come across them in the questions. So if you scan the questions very quickly, then go read the passage, and then you should go back and answer the questions. Okay? It's important that you are reading carefully and that you are choosing the best answer. The SAT will often provide you with more than one seemingly right answer. It's your job to choose the best and most correct answer, so you need to read all the answer choices. And ultimately, you should practice using vocabulary and context before taking the test. Today, we're going to review some practice questions. If you guys have access to this presentation, I would recommend that you pause right now this presentation and you go and just answer the questions on your own and go through the practice questions so that as we're reviewing these, you can see how correct your answers were. Okay, we have 5 practice questions to go through. Each of these practice questions is from the SAT in 2019. So it is last year's SAT questions, and it is how our juniors at that time answered those questions and those results, which means we're currently looking at the class of 2020 when we're looking at these results. First the passage, then the question. Your question that you are answering here is, when Celia tells the narrator not to let Quisqueya put you off, she most nearly means that the narrator should not. The passage, she said Quisqueya dyed her hair, which was hardly news. I had assumed as much when I met her. It's the most unnatural shade of red, Celia said. Raphael says it looks like she dumped a pot of tomato sauce on her head. She chortled. Quisqueya is a busybody, but it's only because she's so insecure. She doesn't know how to connect with people. Don't let her put you off. Again, it's asking what the narrator is trying to say when they say put you off. So she most nearly means that the narrator should not be offended by Quisqueya, be deceived by Quisqueya, let Quisqueya avoid her, or let Quisqueya impose on her. Last year, 63% of Chatfield students got this question correct, very close to where we were in the state and slightly below what the district did. As you can see, this is a medium question for words in context. The correct answer is A. In this context, the phrase put you off most nearly means be offended by. Psychological sciences have a name for this easy automatic simplistic thinking, the illusion of explanatory depth. We strongly believe that we understand complex matters when in fact we are clueless, and these false and extreme beliefs shape our preferences, judgments, and actions, including our votes. The question here, and this is how you'll often see these words in context questions, just asking for a single word and what the definition, what it most nearly means. Right now it's asking what shape means here. When in fact we are clueless and these false extreme beliefs shape our preferences, judgments, and actions, including our votes. Does shape mean A, plan, B, model, C, influence, or D, modify? Last year, 84% of Chatfield students got this correct. That outpaced the district and the state. We did better than the district and the state on this question. As you can see, it's a medium question and is part of a history and social studies passage. The correct answer here is C. Shape in this context most nearly means effect or influence. Shape most nearly means effect or influence. In this passage, you're looking for the word instruments and what the word instruments most nearly means. I rather believe it would put them below the common level of human understanding. But when the leaders choose to make themselves bidders at an auction of popularity, their talents in the construction of the state will be of no service. They will become flatterers instead of legislators, the instruments, not the guides, of the people. If any of them should happen to propose a scheme of liberty, soberly limited and defined with proper qualifications, he will be immediately outbid by his competitors who will produce something more splendidly popular. As used in this passage, instruments most nearly means A, representatives, B, tools, C, counselors, or D, navigators. As you can see, 71% of Chatfield students got this correct last year. It is considered a medium question, words in context, and again is part of a history or social studies passage. The correct answer here is B. Instruments in this context most nearly means tools. Instruments most nearly means tools when looking at it in words in context. In this passage, you are looking for what sober most nearly means, what the word sober most nearly means. Suspicions will be raised of his fidelity to his cause. Moderation will be stigmatized as the virtue of cowards and compromise as the prudence of traitors until, in hopes of preserving the credit which may enable him to temper and moderate on some occasions, the popular leader is obliged to become active in propagating doctrines and establishing powers that will afterwards defeat any sober purpose at which he ultimately might have aimed. In this passage, sober most nearly means A, grave, B, rehabilitated, C, unpretentious, or D, reasonable. This is one of those passages with some outdated wording or some different wording. You'll come across at least one of them that is a pre-Civil War passage, and that is most likely what this one came from. This is A medium level question. 76% of Chatfield students got this correct last year, which was higher than both the district and the state. Again, words in context and is in a historical passage. D is the best answer. Sober in this context most nearly means reasonable. D, sober most nearly means reasonable. This question is asking, the phrase more nuance contrasts most directly with which word in Meltzer's quoted remarks? They also provide lines here so that you guys can navigate those lines and find them. This is partially why you would want to preview the questions beforehand. By seeing that they're going to ask about the term more nuanced, you might pay more attention when you're reading the passage quickly over those 3 to 4 minutes that you're reading it. The supposed younger Dryas impact fails on both theoretical and empirical grounds, says Meltzer, who adds that the popular appeal of the hypothesis is probably due to the way that it provides simple explanations for complex problems. Thus, giant chunks of space debris clobbering the planet and wiping out life on Earth has undeniably broad appeal, Meltzer says, whereas no one in Hollywood makes movies about more nuanced explanations, such as Clovis points disappearing because early Americans turned to other forms of stone tool technology as the large mammals they were hunting went extinct as a result of changing climate or hunting pressure. Your job here is to find the phrase more nuanced contrasts most directly with which word in Meltzer's quoted remarks. So what is the opposite of more nuanced? When answering questions like this, you want to pay attention to a word like contrasts, because now you know you're looking for the opposite. Is it A, theoretical, B, simple, C, complex, or D, broad? As you can see, this is a hard words in context question. It is a science question. 38% of Chatfield students got this correct, which was slightly higher than both the district and the state. The correct answer here is B. In this context, the phrase more nuanced contrasts most directly with the word simple in Meltzer's quoted remarks. More nuanced, the opposite of simple. Those are some sample questions. We have some more later on in our presentation that you guys can go through at your own pace. Right now, we're going to go over overall tips for the reading section. So that's the first section you're going to come across when you take the SAT. Remember, it's 52 questions in 65 minutes, and you are answering questions over the course of 5 different passages. Here are the major SAT reading tips and strategies. You should begin with what you love or what's the easiest. Okay. If you get 50% of the questions correct on the SAT, that is going to result of a score of an 1130. An 1130 is about the average of what Chatfield students get and can get you into most colleges in the state of Colorado. So you want to make sure that you come across as many questions that you can get correct as possible. So if you are previewing passages, you may be the most interested in science passages over social studies, or vice versa. Or you might be more interested in reading a more traditional or a passage that has been more recently written, as opposed to looking at passages that have some archaic or old language. That's why you would be aware of the passage that is written in the 1800s or earlier. Those are going to have more difficult language to navigate, and you may want to spend more time on passages that have a little bit more modern language. You should read for context, main idea, and purpose when you're going through. We're going to practice this more in future boot camps, but those are the 3 things that you should be looking for when you are reading. Preview the questions first, very quickly, and then go and read the passage for your 4 minutes or so. You may want to annotate some of the questions. It'll bring your attention to certain areas, especially with the words in context questions. You'll recognize those phrases as you go through and read if you've previewed the question beforehand. And you should annotate, just like you practice in your passages, you should annotate in the margin some notes that you see. Underline key traditional words or phrases. We have the example in here of like the word contrasts. That lets you know that you're looking for opposite instead of most nearly means. But also those transitional phrases that you may see, like except or because, things like that when you're seeing them in the passage. When looking at vocabulary, you have to be aware, especially in the words and context, that the most common definition that you're used to coming across is very rarely the answer that they're looking for. They are looking for things that are more difficult or maybe the less common definition that you're used to. So they will often put the most common definition in there, and that is to take away your attention from what is actually the correct answer. Just because something sounds familiar does not necessarily mean it's correct. We talked about this in the Writing and Lang Bootcamp, and it still stands true here. Just because it's something that sounds familiar does not mean it's correct. It's important to read very closely. Do not spend too long in any particular question. Remember, you're at a race to get as many questions correct as you possibly can. If you're really struggling with a question, you should eliminate answer choices that are not correct, and then from there, choose your best option and move on. You may be missing easier questions later on in the reading section if you spend too much time trying to figure out a hard question. And do not read the lines of text, even if it says go to line 45. Do not just go to that line. You need to read the entire passage for context. As a reminder, here's the 4 ways that we've put in front of you to prepare for the SAT over the course of the next few weeks. Number 1 is spending time on Khan Academy. We've asked you to spend 10 hours on Khan Academy, and for most of you, it means that you'll see 90 to 130 points of growth when compared to how you did on the PSAT that you took in October. You should use myresults.collegeboard.org to review your past tests and look at any of the questions you've missed and see how you would answer them differently. So you can go back and review all your previous results and look at every question you've missed on the PSAT 9, PSAT 10, or PSAT. You should continue attending the rest of the SAT boot camps. In our next topic, will be main idea. The topics are author's purpose, and we will be looking at some more words in context and how it plays to those things. So attend those SAT boot camps for math or for the EBRW portion of the test. And there's always the option of college drive tutoring and preparation. They use the results from your practice test that you took in February to be able to offer some tutoring sessions. That comes at a cost as opposed to the others, but if you're willing to pay for that, they will be running practice sessions from spring, or preparation and tutoring sessions from spring break to the time of the test. In this presentation, I've included some more additional practice questions that you can work through on your own as you have time. These have full explanations that you can read through as to why they are the correct answer, and is some additional practice for you. I'd like you to consider and think about this. What is the one aha? What's the one thing that you are pulling from this presentation and this boot camp that will make sure that you're more prepared for the reading section of that SAT, that all-important first section that you come across on the SAT. Thank you for your time to go through this boot camp session and for continuing to prepare so that you guys can do the best you possibly can on the upcoming SAT. Thank you.